For 3 years, I treated her like she was invisible, like she was just the maid. She owned the entire building, and I never even asked her last name.
She worked as his maid for 3 years. The day she quit, he discovered she owned the entire building, the woman who scrubbed. His floors for 3 years owned the entire building the whole time, and Cyrus Vale only found out the day she walked away. Before we go any deeper, I need to thank every single one of you watching right now. Because of your incredible support, Mr. Steele Rich Stories just passed 4,000 subscribers. That number might seem small to some channels, but to me, it represents 4,000 people who chose to hear these stories, and I'm beyond grateful. Right now, I'm asking you to do one thing: share this video with at least one friend or family member who's ever underestimated someone based on their job. Send it to that person who needs to hear this message, because what you're about to witness will change how you see everyone around you. Let me say it again so it really sinks in. For 3 years, Serenity James cleaned Cyrus Vale's penthouse apartment. She mopped his floors, organized his closets, and listened to his complaints. The entire time, she owned the 42-story building he lived in. He called her the Maid. She was his landlord. Have you ever looked at someone in a service uniform and made assumptions about their life? Or maybe you've been on the other side. Maybe you've been the one people looked through, talked over, or dismissed because of the work you do. If either of those hit home, then you need to hear what happened between Cyrus and Serenity. Here's the problem that destroyed everything. Cyrus didn't just treat Serenity like an employee. In his worst moments, he threw cutting words at her, dismissed her intelligence, and made her feel small. He thought he was talking down to someone beneath him. He was actually insulting the one person who held his entire world in her hands. Stay with me to the end to see what he did when he realized the person he'd hurt was the one holding the keys, not just to his home, but to his future. Cyrus Vale stood in his penthouse on the 38th floor of Harborview Residences, still wearing his wrinkled work shirt from the trading floor. The evening light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows did nothing to warm the cold realization settling in his chest. In his left hand, he held a small piece of paper, Serenity's resignation letter, if you could even call 3 sentences a letter. In his right hand, he gripped an ivory envelope that had been delivered by courier service 20 minutes ago. The resignation note was written on plain notebook paper in Serenity's careful handwriting. "Mr. Vale, I will no longer be providing cleaning services. Your new housekeeper starts Monday. Thank you for 3 years of employment. S. James." The formal letter was different. Expensive paper, embossed letterhead from Malik and Rowe Legal Group. "Dear Mr. Vale, we are writing to inform you regarding Harborview Residences ownership. Our client, MS Serenity James, sole owner of the property, requests your presence at a reception on Friday, November 17th, at 7 p.m. in the 20th floor community lounge. This gathering will address important building initiatives and future plans. Your attendance is expected as a valued member of our residential community." His eyes kept jumping between the 2 signatures. That same looping S that started both. The same careful slant in James. His brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. "Serenity James," he said out loud to his empty apartment. In 3 years, he'd never asked her last name. She was just Serenity, or more often, just the maid. Sometimes, when he was feeling generous, "My housekeeper." The letter from the law firm crinkled as his hand started shaking. Sole owner, not part owner, not representative of the owner. She owned everything, every apartment, every parking space, every square foot of marble in the lobby. He walked through each morning while she was already upstairs, cleaning his bathroom. The memories came in flashes, each one worse than the last. 6 months ago, during a particularly stressful week when his company faced a potential investor revolt, she'd quietly organized his chaos. He'd been living on 4 hours of sleep, surviving on coffee and panic, and his penthouse reflected it, papers everywhere, dishes piling up, laundry scattered across furniture. She'd come in on her regular Friday and created order without comment, without judgment. She'd even left a note on his reorganized desk: "Hard times don't last. Hard workers do. You've got this." He'd barely glanced at it before diving back into his crisis. 2 weeks before today, she'd tried to warn him about his investment portfolio while dusting his home office. He'd been reviewing quarterly reports, and she'd quietly mentioned that the Henderson Tech merger didn't look stable. The debt ratios were off, she'd said. Executive compensation packages are too generous right before a major acquisition. Classic signs of a company trying to hide problems. He remembered his exact words because they'd felt so satisfying at the time. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm paying you to clean, not to give business advice. Stick to what you know." The Henderson Tech deal collapsed 3 days later. He lost $40,000. She knew it would crash, and she tried to help him anyway. Last month, and this memory made him physically ill, he'd organized a petition among the residents to reduce what he'd called unnecessary staff expenses. Specifically, he'd targeted the building's practice of giving cleaning crew and maintenance workers holiday bonuses. He'd gathered signatures from 15 other residents, presented it to building management, with a detailed argument about how these bonuses inflated their monthly fees. She would have been in that meeting. As the owner, she would have sat there and listened to him argue that people like her, people he thought were like her, didn't deserve holiday bonuses because their work wasn't valuable enough to warrant extra compensation. And she'd never said a word, never pulled rank, never embarrassed him, never used her power to put him in his place. The night they'd been trapped in the elevator together came back to him with brutal clarity now. It was about 10 months ago. A storm had knocked out power to half the building, and he and Serenity had been stuck between the 22nd and 23rd floors for almost an hour. He'd been in the middle of a company crisis, a bug in his trading algorithm that had temporarily misreported client balances. He'd been furious, panicked, taking call after call while trapped in that small space. She'd been coming back from helping the building engineer assess water damage. On the upper floors, her work clothes damp, exhaustion written across her face. When his phone finally died and he'd run out of people to yell at, she'd started talking, calmly, steadily, about coastal birds, terns and plovers and their migration patterns, how they navigated thousands of miles using landmarks and instinct, how they returned to the same nesting grounds year after year because some things were worth coming back to. He'd thought she was just trying to distract him from his claustrophobia, filling the silence with random facts. Now he understood she'd been managing his panic while dealing with her own, using her voice to keep both of them grounded while they waited for rescue. Later that same night, after they'd been freed and he'd rushed back to his penthouse to continue his crisis management, she'd sent a text to his phone. He'd been surprised she had his number, must have gotten it from building records, he'd assumed. The message was simple. Honest communication fixes most problems. Your clients will forgive a mistake if you tell them the truth before they hear it from someone else. He'd taken her advice, made personal calls to his 14 largest clients, explained the bug directly, outlined the fixes. 12 of them had stayed with him. 2 had left, but with professional courtesy rather than threats of lawsuits. Her advice had saved his company. He'd never thanked her, never even acknowledged that he'd followed her suggestion. The coffee. God, the coffee. She'd taught him how she made it about 8 months ago. He'd caught her making herself a cup one morning, something she rarely did, preferring to wait until she got home. He'd asked what smelled different, and she'd explained cinnamon and a small amount of milk, the way her father had taught her. Coffee should slow you down, not speed you up, she'd said, handing him a cup to try. Make you present, instead of just waking up. It had been the best coffee he'd ever tasted. She'd left him a jar of cinnamon the next visit with a note, in case you want to slow down sometimes. He'd been making it her way every morning since. Had never told her that her father's recipe had become part of his daily routine, that those few minutes of preparation had become the only pause in his 18-hour workdays. The lighthouse mug sat on his counter now, both of them actually. The original one she'd glued back together after he'd smashed it during a market crash, now serving as a pen holder with its cracks visible and honest. And the replacement she'd bought him, white ceramic with a painted lighthouse. Similar enough to matter, but not trying to erase what had been broken. That had been about 7 months ago. He'd been up since 3 in the morning, watching Singapore markets implode, and, when his final position collapsed, he'd slammed his hand on the table in rage. The mug, the only thing in his expensive apartment that actually meant something, had jumped and shattered against the marble floor. She'd arrived 30 minutes later to find him sitting in the wreckage, surrounded by ceramic shards and spilled coffee. He'd yelled at her not to touch it, had actually shouted at a woman who was trying to help him because he was angry at markets he couldn't control. She'd cleaned it up anyway, carefully collected every piece, told him she'd try to glue it back together. "You don't have to do that," he'd said, already ashamed of his outburst. "I know," she replied, "but I'm going anyway." The next visit, she'd brought both mugs, the glued original with a note for the things worth keeping, still useful, just different, and the new one with its message for the rough mornings. He'd never properly thanked her for that either. Cyrus walked through his penthouse now, seeing 3 years of invisible care in every detail. The books on his shelf weren't just straightened, they were organized by subject and then by author within each category, arranged in a way that actually matched how he used them. His work references near his desk, his business biographies by his reading chair, the 3 novels he pretended he didn't own tucked in the corner where he could reach them during the rare moments he admitted he needed fiction. His charging cables weren't just untangled, they were labeled and organized by device coiled neatly in a drawer she'd designated for that purpose. A small label in her handwriting, phone, tablet, laptop, MISC. His mail didn't just sit in a pile, it was sorted into 3 trays she'd brought from somewhere. Red for urgent, yellow for soon, green for this month. Another note, this one making him smile despite everything. Things that might make you trip and die, now color, coded. His kitchen reflected the same careful attention. Spices alphabetized, even though he only owned 3. Take-out menus organized by cuisine and delivery time. A small first aid kit in the drawer by the stove with a note. For when you inevitably burn yourself making midnight coffee, he'd used that kit twice. Never wondered how it had appeared. The plant by his window, some kind of fern he'd received as a housewarming gift and immediately neglected, was thriving. Deep green and healthy, obviously watered on a schedule he'd never maintained. She'd been keeping it alive for 3 years, while he'd barely registered its existence. In his closet, his clothes weren't just hung up, they were organized by formality and color. Work shirts together, casual clothes separate, everything facing the same direction. His shoes lined up and recently polished, even though he'd never asked for that service. She'd been taking care of him, not just cleaning his space, but actively making his life more manageable, more organized, more human. Creating systems he could maintain, leaving notes that made him laugh, solving problems he didn't know he had. And he treated her like she was invisible. Worse than invisible, disposable. The final memory hit him like a punch to the chest. Yesterday morning, the words he'd said had driven her away. He'd been preparing for his board meeting, terrified that his primary investor was trying to force him out of his own company. 4 days of barely sleeping, living on coffee and adrenaline, his penthouse reflecting his internal chaos. She'd arrived at her regular time and found disaster. Clothes everywhere, dishes piled up, trash overflowing. She'd started cleaning quietly, humming softly while she worked. That gentle melody she used when she was processing her own stress, a habit he'd grown so accustomed to that he barely noticed it anymore. Except yesterday, his nerves were shredded and his control was gone. He'd snapped at her to stop humming. She'd apologized and gone quiet, but 5 minutes later, she'd been humming again. Not deliberately, just the unconscious rhythm of someone trying to self-soothe through work. "I said stop," he'd barked. Some of us are dealing with actual crises here. She'd looked up from folding his shirts, hurt flashing across her face before she'd controlled it. "I have crises too, Mr. Vale," she'd said quietly. "You're not the only person in this building trying to keep lives from collapsing." He should have apologized then, should have recognized that he was doing exactly what he'd promised himself he wouldn't do after. The elevator, taking his stress out on the one person who'd shown him nothing but kindness. Instead, his fear and exhaustion had pushed him over the edge. Right, he'd said, sarcasm dripping from every word. I'm sure deciding which apartment to clean next is exactly like fighting to keep the company I built from scratch. That's not what I said. But that's what you meant, right? That your problems are somehow equivalent to mine? He gestured at his screens, at the chaos of his crisis. I'm about to lose everything I've worked for. So forgive me if I don't have the bandwidth to care about whatever small problems you're dealing with while you're here cleaning my apartment. The silence that had followed was absolute. She'd set down his clothes very carefully. Just the maid, she'd said softly. Got it. Serenity, I didn't mean... No, you're absolutely right. Her voice had been steady, but her hands were shaking. You're paying for cleaning services, not for me to care about what happens to you. My mistake for thinking we were... She'd stopped herself. I'll make sure your new housekeeper understands the boundaries better. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I quit, Mr. Vale. I'll have the agency send someone else starting Monday. Someone who understands that their job is just to clean, not to... Her voice had caught. Not to care. She'd walked out while he was still trying to form an apology, the door closing with a soft click that sounded final. He'd told himself he'd fix it on her next visit, that he'd apologize properly, explain about the board meeting stress, make her understand he hadn't meant it. But there would be no next visit. Cyrus sank onto his leather couch now, holding both letters, understanding the full magnitude of what he'd lost. The woman he'd dismissed as just the maid could buy his entire life 10 times over. The person he'd snapped at for humming owned the building he lived in. The advice he'd rejected about Henderson Tech had come from someone who probably had better financial advisors and information sources than he'd ever accessed. She'd tried to warn him. I tried to help him. I tried to care about him. And he told her that her problems didn't matter because she cleaned toilets for a living. Except she didn't clean toilets for a living. She owned a $92 million real estate portfolio and had chosen to spend 3 years scrubbing floors in her own building to honor her father's dying wish that she truly understand what she owned before she decided what to do with it. While he'd been condescending to her about business advice, she'd been running a property empire. While he'd been dismissing her intelligence, she'd been making decisions that affected 400 residents' lives. While he'd been treating her like hired help, she'd been choosing kindness over power every single day. She could have evicted him at any time, could have raised his rent to force him out, could have made his life miserable in 1,000 legal ways after every thoughtless comment, every casual dismissal, every moment he'd made her feel small. Instead, she'd shown up every Tuesday and Friday, done her job perfectly, left notes that made him laugh, and endured every cutting word he'd thrown her way with grace he didn't deserve. The legal letter mentioned a reception for valued members of our residential community, not a private meeting to discuss his lease, not a confrontation about his behavior, just an invitation to a community gathering where she'd presumably announce whatever plans she had for the building's future. She wasn't even going to call him out publicly, wasn't going to embarrass him or use her power to humiliate him. She was just going to step into her real role and let him live with the knowledge of who he'd been to her. Cyrus picked up his phone, thought about calling her, then realized he didn't have her number. Not her personal one, just the cleaning service's main line, and that would be pointless now. He could go down to the 15th floor, knock on doors until he found her apartment, and force a conversation. But what would he say? That he was sorry for 3 years of casual cruelty, that he was sorry he'd only seen her as a function rather than a person, that he was sorry he'd measured her worth by her job instead of her character, that he was sorry he'd needed her to own the building before he could respect her intelligence. The truth sitting in his chest was uglier than he wanted to face. If she'd never quit, if he'd never received this letter, he probably would have continued treating her exactly the same way. He'd have kept taking her kindness for granted, kept dismissing her thoughts, kept seeing her as background, rather than as a complete human being with her own complex life. He was only sorry now because he'd been caught, because he'd discovered that the person he'd been casually cruel to had the power to make his life very difficult. That wasn't growth. That was just self-preservation with guilt attached. Cyrus stood and walked to his window, looking down at the city below. Somewhere in this building, 15 floors down, Serenity James was probably sitting in her own apartment, maybe making coffee with cinnamon the way her father had taught her, maybe reading behavioral economics books, maybe processing 3 years of being invisible to someone she'd tried to care about despite every reason not to. The reception was in 6 days. Friday, at 7. He'd go, because the invitation made it clear that attendance was expected. He'd sit in that 20th floor lounge and watch her step into her role as owner. And he'd have to face what it meant that he'd treated her the way he had. But before that, he needed to understand something. Needed to know who Serenity James really was beyond the 3 years she'd spent making his life livable while he'd barely acknowledged her existence. He opened his laptop and started researching. Walter James, her father, the name came up immediately. A real estate developer, died 3 years ago of a sudden heart attack at age 62. Owned 6 commercial properties and 4 residential buildings in the city, known for fair rent practices and tenant-focused management. Local business articles called him the landlord who cared more about communities than profit margins. Obituaries mentioned that he was survived by his daughter, Serenity James, who inherited his entire real estate portfolio. No other family listed. Cyrus found photos from charity events Walter had attended. A tall man with kind eyes and Serenity's same careful smile. In every picture, he was talking to someone. Really talking, leaning in, listening with full attention. Never the center of attention himself, but always present for whoever needed him. One article from 8 years ago quoted him, "You don't truly own a building until you've swept its floors yourself. Anyone can buy property. Understanding what you own, that takes getting your hands dirty." Another quote, this one from an interview about his management philosophy, "I measure my success by how many families have stable housing, not by how much rent I collect. Money is just a tool. What matters is what you build with it." Serenity had told him once that her father measured people's worth by how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them, that he cared more about communities than profit margins. She'd been describing the man who taught her everything she knew about power, and dignity, and the responsibility that came with owning things other people needed. And Cyrus had dismissed her wisdom as the naive thoughts of someone who cleaned houses. He found the deed transfer records. Harborview Residences had been transferred to Serenity James 3 years and 2 months ago, shortly after Walter's death. She'd inherited it along with the rest of his portfolio, a total estate value of approximately $92 million. She'd been a multi-millionaire the entire time she'd been scrubbing his toilet. Cyrus closed his laptop and sat in the dark of his penthouse, surrounded by evidence of her care. The organized books, the sorted mail, the thriving plant, the glued mug with its honest cracks. She'd spent 3 years teaching him lessons he'd been too blind to see. Those broken things could still be useful. Those small acts of kindness mattered. That real strength was shown in how you treated people when you had all the power, and they had none. He'd failed every single test. The only question now was whether he could become someone different in the 6 days he had before facing her again. Not because she owned his building and could make his life difficult, but because she deserved better than the man he'd been. Whether he could learn to see people, all people, not just the ones with obvious power, as fully human, worth listening to, worth respecting, worth caring about. Whether he could figure out how to apologize to someone who didn't need his apology, didn't need his money, didn't need anything from him at all. Cyrus picked up both lighthouse mugs and carried them to his kitchen. Made coffee the way she'd taught him, cinnamon and milk, slow and present. Poured it into the new mug while the glued one sat nearby, its cracks visible in the evening light. Still useful, her note had said. Just different. He hoped that applied to people too. That someone who'd been careless and cruel could learn to be different, could be useful in ways that mattered, because in 6 days he was going to walk into that 20th floor lounge and face the woman he'd wronged. And he wanted to be someone she might eventually forgive, not because she had to, but because he'd proven he could change. The coffee was perfect. It always was when he followed her instructions. He just wished he'd been following her wisdom all along. To understand how Serenity James ended up cleaning toilets in a building she owned, we need to go back 3 years and 2 months to the moment her world collapsed and rebuilt itself in the same afternoon. The offices of Malik and Rowe Legal Group occupied the entire 20th floor of a downtown high-rise. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city sprawling below, all glass and steel and constant motion. Inside Conference Room C, the air smelled like leather furniture and expensive coffee, and Serenity James sat in a chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent, trying to process the fact that her father was gone. Walter James had died 5 days ago. Sudden heart attack while reviewing property reports in his home office. One moment he'd been alive, making notes about a tenant family that needed help with medical bills. The next moment he was on the floor, and no amount of CPR or paramedic response time could bring him back. Serenity had found him, had called 911 while doing chest compressions she'd learned years ago but never thought she'd use, had watched the ambulance take him away and knew, even before the hospital confirmed it, that her father was already gone. The funeral was 2 days ago. Standing room only at a service that was supposed to hold 200 people. Tenants from all 6 of his properties had shown up, maintenance workers and property managers, small business owners he'd given affordable lease terms, families he'd helped through rough patches with reduced rent and patient understanding. Person after person had approached her with stories. How Walter had given them a chance when no other landlord would. How he'd personally helped them move in when they couldn't afford movers. How he'd shown up with groceries during a job loss, tools during a plumbing emergency, patience during late rent payments that other owners would have turned into eviction notices. "Your father saw people," one elderly woman had said, gripping Serenity's hands. "Really saw them. Not as income sources, but as human beings trying to survive. He saved my family when we had nowhere else to go." Now Serenity sat across from Elliot Rowe, her father's attorney and friend of 20 years, while he explained that Walter James had left her everything. "The total value of the estate is approximately $92 million, Elliot said, sliding documents across the mahogany table. His voice was gentle but professional, walking the line between grief and business that estate attorneys learn to navigate. This includes 6 commercial properties, 4 residential buildings, and various investment accounts. However, the centerpiece of your inheritance is Harborview Residences." Serenity's breath caught. Harborview, her father's first major acquisition, his favorite building, the property. He'd driven her past every Sunday morning when she was growing up. "See that building, sweetheart?" he'd say, slowing the car so she could look up at the 42 stories of glass and concrete. "I bought that when everyone said I was crazy. It was falling apart, half empty. The previous owner had let it rot from neglect. But I saw what it could be. It took 2 years, and every dollar I could borrow, but we brought it back. Now it's home to 400 people, 400 lives that are a little more stable because we chose to care." He'd bought Harborview 15 years ago, when Serenity was 12. She remembered the renovation years, remembered her father coming home exhausted, covered in drywall dust because he'd been working alongside the contractors. "I remembered him learning every tenant's name within the first month, asking about their kids, their jobs, their dreams." "Harborview is yours now," Elliot continued, "along with the Riverside Complex, the Meridian Apartments, and the 2 smaller buildings on the east side, the commercial properties as well, the retail plaza on Grant Street, the office building downtown, and the 4 small storefronts in the Arts District." Serenity looked at the papers but couldn't focus on the numbers. Her father's entire life's work reduced to asset valuations and property deeds. "There's something else," Elliot said. He reached into a folder and pulled out several pages of yellow legal pad paper covered in her father's familiar handwriting. "Walter gave this to me 2 months ago. He called it his real will, the part that mattered more than the legal documents." Serenity took the pages with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away and started reading. The first page was dated 8 weeks before his death. "My dearest Serenity," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry I won't be there to see the incredible things you're going to do. But before you reshape the future, I need you to understand the present. And I don't mean understanding from quarterly reports or property manager summaries. I mean really understanding what you own and who depends on it. Her father's voice came through so clearly in the writing that she could almost hear him speaking. I'm asking you, not legally required, because this isn't about obligation, but asking your father who loves you and trusts your judgment to spend at least 1 year working in a service role within one of the properties, not as owner, not as manager, but as someone who serves. Clean apartments, fix things, hear complaints. See what it's actually like to be the person residents call when their heat stops working at 2 in the morning. Serenity read the words twice, then a third time. I know this sounds strange, the letter continued. You have a business degree. You're brilliant with numbers and strategy. You could walk into any of these buildings as an owner tomorrow and run them competently from a distance. But competent isn't what I built. I built communities. And you can't understand the community from a management office. The next section explained his reasoning. When I bought Harborview, I spent the first 6 months working maintenance with Hector Ruiz. I unclogged toilets and fixed leaky faucets and hauled garbage. I heard what tenants said when they didn't know the owner was listening. I learned which families were struggling, which elderly residents needed extra help, which single parents were working 3 jobs just to make rent. I learned the difference between numbers on a spreadsheet and the human lives behind those numbers. Serenity remembered those months. She'd been 12 years old, confused about why her father came home smelling like cleaning chemicals when he owned the building. People told me I was crazy, Walter had written. Said I was wasting time that could be spent on investor meetings and property management. But those 6 months taught me more about what I owned than any financial report ever could. They taught me that buildings are just concrete and steel, communities are made of people. And if you don't know the people, you don't really know what you own. The letter shifted to instructions. So here's my request, pick one property. Harborview would be my choice. It's the biggest, the most diverse, the most challenging. Get a job there in whatever capacity lets you see how it really operates. Use your first name only. Don't tell anyone who you are. Just work, watch, and learn. Serenity could picture her father writing this, probably late at night in his home office, thinking about how to pass on lessons that couldn't be taught through inheritance documents. You'll see things that bother you, the letter continued. Systems that don't work. Residents who are struggling, maybe even employees or managers who aren't living up to the standards we've set. Don't fix everything immediately. Sit with discomfort. Understand the full scope of the problems before you start solving them. Quick fixes from the top down rarely address root causes. The final page shifted tone, becoming more personal. I know I'm asking a lot. I know you could sell everything tomorrow, take the money, and build whatever life you want. $92 million is freedom, sweetheart. It's security for your entire life. And then some. But I didn't build this empire just to create wealth. I built it to prove that you can be successful in business while still treating people with dignity. That profit and compassion aren't opposites. Her father's next words hit like a physical blow. I've had offers to sell, you know. 3 different development groups over the past 5 years wanted to buy Harborview. The most recent offer was $105 million, more than I paid for all. 6 properties combined. They had plans to optimize it, raise rents, convert apartments to short-term executive housing, push out the long-term tenants, and replace them with people who could pay more. Serenity hadn't known about those offers. Her father had never mentioned them. I turned them all down, Walter had written. Not because I didn't want the money. That kind of cash could have funded every charitable dream I ever had, but it would have come at the cost of displacing 400 people who trusted me to provide stable housing. That's not a trade I was willing to make. I hope you'll feel the same way, but I can't make that choice for you. You'll have to decide what kind of owner you want to be. The letter's conclusion was simple and devastating. Remember this, sweetheart. Money doesn't change people. It reveals them. When you have power over others, and as a landlord, you do have power, watch how you use it. Do you lift people up or push them down? Do you see them as whole human beings or as monthly payments? That tells you everything about who you really are. I raised you to be better than most people in this business. Now it's time to prove I was right. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I trust you to honor not just the buildings, but the communities inside them. Dad. Serenity set down the pages, her hands shaking. Elliot waited patiently, understanding that some moments needed silence. He really wants me to clean apartments, she said finally. In my own building. He's not requiring it, Elliot reminded her. You own everything free and clear regardless. This is what he called a request from beyond. You could walk into Harborview tomorrow as owner, hire a management company, and never set foot inside again. Plenty of property owners operate that way. But that's not who he was. No, Elliot agreed. It wasn't. Serenity thought about the two paths ahead of her. She could be the distant owner, managing everything through emails and quarterly reports, review financial statements, approve budgets, collect checks, and never know if apartment 12C had working heat or if the 7th floor hallway smelled like mildew after rain. It would be easier, cleaner, more in line with how most people managed real estate portfolios worth $92 million. Or she could honor her father's request, really honor it, not just going through the motions but fully committing. Work in the building without the protection of her last name or bank account. See what people said when they didn't know the owner was listening. Learn the difference between reading about a broken water heater and being the person who had to clean up after it flooded someone's apartment. What do you think he would have wanted? Serenity asked. I think Walter would have wanted you to make your own choice, Elliot said. But I also think he wrote this letter because he knew what choice you'd make. He knew you well enough to understand that you'd want to do it right, even if right was harder than easy. Serenity picked up the yellow pages again, reading the closing lines. I trust you to honor not just the buildings, but the communities inside them. That was the key phrase. Communities, not properties, not assets. Communities made of people with names and stories and lives that would continue long after she signed the inheritance papers. I'll do it, Serenity said. But I'll do it properly, first name only, no special treatment. I want to see what he saw when he was working maintenance all those years ago. Elliot raised an eyebrow. You're going to hide your identity? Not hide, just not advertise. She thought about her father's words about power and revelation. People act differently around owners. They're more careful, more filtered. I want to see the real operation, not the version people show the boss. That could get complicated. Some staff members will need to know, the property manager, probably the head of maintenance, for security and access reasons. Then we tell them, but we swear them to secrecy. Everyone else thinks I'm just another employee. Serenity was already planning the logistics. How long before the estate is settled? 2 weeks for the paperwork to process. Then everything transfers to you officially. And Harborview's current management structure? Jordan Patel is the property manager, reporting to the management company your father contracted with. Arturo Ortega runs maintenance, having been there since your father bought the building. Cleaning services are contracted through a third-party company. Building operations are stable. Your father ran things well. I'll need to meet with Jordan and Arturo. Quietly. Explain what I'm doing and why. Serenity was thinking like her father now, considering all the angles. They'll need to treat me like any other employee, even knowing who I am. Think they can do that? Jordan's professional, maybe too professional sometimes. Gets complaints from tenants who think he cares more about the budget than their problems. Arturo's different, old school, deeply loyal to your father. If you tell him this is what Walter wanted, he'll protect your cover. Serenity nodded, filing away the information. Jordan might be part of what her father wanted her to investigate. Management that prioritized budgets over people was exactly the kind of thing that looked fine on paper but felt wrong in practice. What about the other properties? She asked. They run themselves for now. You have good managers in place at each one. Nothing requires immediate attention. And the offers to sell? Are development groups still interested? Elliot hesitated. Actually, yes. A firm called Silvergate Group reached out 3 weeks ago. They'd heard Walter was ill and wanted to express interest in Harborview if the family ever considered selling. very preliminary, very respectful. I told them we'd be in touch after the estate was settled. What kind of firm is Silvergate? Property development and optimization. They buy older residential buildings, renovate them, and reposition them for higher income tenants. Very successful track record from a business perspective. Translation: they displaced existing tenants and maximized profit. Exactly what her father had refused to do. Put them off, Serenity said, politely but firmly. We're not selling, not even hearing the offer. She thought about her father's letter, about the 105 million he'd turned down, about 400 people who depended on Harborview remained what it was, not even hearing it. I need to understand what I own before I decide what to do with it. And I can't do that while fielding acquisition offers. Elliot made a note. Understood. Anything else? Yes. I want to set up a meeting with Jordan and Arturo for next week. Somewhere private, not at Harborview. I'll explain what I'm doing, get their cooperation, and figure out the logistics of working undercover in my own building. And what will you tell the cleaning company when you apply? Serenity smiled slightly. That I need steady work, and I've heard Harborview treats its employees fairly. Which is true, as far as it goes. They spent the next hour reviewing the details of the estate. Property valuations, tax implications, management contracts, insurance policies. The business side of inheriting an empire built on the principle that business should serve people, not the other way around. When Serenity finally left the law offices, it was late afternoon. The city stretched out below her, millions of people in millions of buildings, all of them needing shelter and safety, and someone who saw them as more than rent checks. Her father had seen them, had built his entire business on the radical idea that landlords should care about their tenants' well-being. Now it was her turn to prove she could do the same. She drove to Harborview, parked in the visitor lot, and sat looking up at the 42 stories of glass and steel that now belonged to her. Her father's favorite building, his first big risk, his proof that you could be successful without being cruel. Somewhere in there, 400 people were living their lives, cooking dinner, helping kids with homework, worrying about bills, celebrating small victories. They didn't know that Walter James was gone, didn't know that his daughter was about to walk into their building with a mop and a bucket, trying to understand what it meant to serve the community she'd inherited. Serenity got out of her car and walked to the main entrance. The lobby was beautiful, restored marble floors, Art Deco fixtures that her father had preserved from the building's original 1920s construction. A bulletin board near the mailboxes was covered with notices, a bake sale fundraiser, a lost cat poster, someone offering piano lessons, a babysitting service. This was a community, real people connecting, helping each other, building something larger than their individual apartments. She wanted to protect this, wanted to be worthy of the trust these 400 people had placed in her father and would now, unknowingly, place in her. But first, she had to understand it. Serenity pulled out her phone and took a photo of the bulletin board, started a note titled Harborview Observations, and wrote her first entry, Community exists in small spaces, bulletin boards, lobby conversations, the way people hold doors for each other. Dad was right. You can't see this from quarterly reports. Over the next 2 weeks, she prepared, met with Jordan Patel and Arturo Ortega in a quiet coffee shop across town, explained her father's request and her decision to honor it. Jordan had been skeptical. With all due respect, Miss James, working undercover seems inefficient. You could learn everything you need from management reports and tenant surveys. Could I? Serenity had challenged gently. Could I learn what it feels like to clean up after someone who treats you like you're invisible? Could I learn which residents are kind to service workers and which ones are dismissive? Could I understand the difference between a building that's well managed on paper and one that actually feels like home? Jordan had gone quiet, maybe recognizing that her questions touched on things his reports didn't measure. Arturo understood immediately. Walter did the same thing, he'd said, his voice thick with memory. Worked alongside me for 6 months. Best boss I ever had, because he never asked me to do anything he wasn't willing to do himself. You're just like him. I hope so, Serenity had replied. But I need your help, both of you. You'll have to treat me like any other employee when we're at the building. No special consideration, no protection. If I mess up, correct me like you would anyone else." They'd agreed, though she could see Jordan calculating the liability, issues, and Arturo fighting the instinct to protect Walter's daughter. She'd also visited her father's grave before starting, brought flowers, sat on the grass next to the headstone, and talked to him like he was still there to listen. "I'm doing what you asked," she'd said, "going to clean apartments in my own building because you thought it was important. I trust you, even though this seems crazy. I just hope I'm strong enough to see what you saw without losing faith in people. Because I suspect I'm going to witness some ugly stuff, how people treat those they think are beneath them, how power and assumptions make people cruel without even realizing it." The wind had moved through the cemetery trees, and Serenity had chosen to believe it was her father's way of saying he had faith in her. 2 days later, she'd stood outside Harborview's service entrance at 6 in the morning, wearing cheap work clothes she'd bought specifically for this, holding a job application she'd filled out the night before. First name only, Serenity. Previous experience, private residential cleaning. Reason for applying, need steady work. This building has a reputation for treating employees fairly. All technically true, even if the full truth was infinitely more complicated. Arturo had met her at the service entrance and played his role perfectly. Reviewed her application with skeptical eyes, asked hard questions, made her prove she was serious about the work. Ever cleaned for a living before, Serenity? He'd emphasized the word living, testing her. Not professionally, she'd admitted. But I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learned fast. Why this job? Why here? I need steady work, and this building has a good reputation. He'd studied her for a long moment, and she'd seen the double meaning in his eyes. Testing if she could really do this, if she could handle being treated as just another employee when she owned everything around them. Trial period, he'd said finally. You'll start with common areas, lobbies, hallways, fitness centers. If you last 2 weeks without complaints, we'll talk about adding residential units to your route. Pay is minimum wage plus tips if residents offer them. You provide your own work clothes. The building provides cleaning supplies. Thank you, she'd said, meaning it more than he could acknowledge. Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow, 5 a.m. sharp. Morning shift catches all the overnight messes. And so it had begun. 3 years of mopping floors she owned, cleaning windows in her own building, being invisible to people whose rent payments funded her life. 3 years of learning exactly what her father had wanted her to learn. That buildings were just structures, but communities were fragile ecosystems that required constant care, that people revealed their true character in how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them. That wealth and power didn't make you better than anyone, they just gave you more responsibility to use both wisely. That her father had been right about everything, and that somewhere in Harborview, there would be people who tested every lesson she was trying to learn. People who would remind her why this work mattered, and why her father had asked her to do it. People like Cyrus Vale, who would move into the penthouse 6 months into her undercover work and spend the next 2.5 years teaching her exactly how much patience and grace her father's lessons required. But she didn't know that yet. On her first morning, Serenity James simply cleaned. Mopped lobby floors, scrubbed elevator interiors, emptied trash bins, made herself invisible while learning to really see. And with every hour of work, she understood her inheritance a little better. Not the $92 million, the 400 lives that depended on her choosing compassion over profit every single day for as long as she owned these buildings. That was the real inheritance. Everything else was just paperwork. 6 months after Serenity James started working at Harborview, the penthouse on the 38th floor finally got a new tenant. She was in the 20th floor lounge restocking cleaning supplies when Arturo found her. Big news, he said, his tone neutral in that way that meant he had opinions he wouldn't share. Penthouse is getting rented. Some tech money guy, Cyrus Vale, moving in next month. Serenity looked up from the spray bottle she was organizing. The penthouse had been empty since Mrs. Chen, the previous owner, had moved to assisted living 8 months ago. It was the crown jewel of Harborview, 4,200 square feet. Floor-to-ceiling windows, harbor views that stretched for miles. "What's he like?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. Arturo shrugged. "Hasn't moved in yet, but he negotiated hard on the rent even though he's supposedly loaded. Send a 2-page list of requirements. Wants specific cleaning products, exact scheduling, no disruptions during his work hours. The type who notices if you move his pen an inch. Sounds particular. Sounds difficult." Arturo handed her a clipboard. "You'll probably get assigned to clean it once Jordan approves him. We rotate the luxury units among our most reliable people. You've been doing good work. No complaints in 6 months. You're ready for residential." Serenity took the clipboard, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. This was what her father had meant. The common areas taught her about building operations and maintenance. But residential units, that's where she'd really see how people lived, what they valued, how they treated the people who kept their spaces clean. "When does he move in?" 2 weeks. Jordan's finalizing the lease now. Guy runs some kind of tech company, Northline something, makes algorithms that predict market movements. Very successful, very demanding. After Arturo left, Serenity pulled up Northline Dynamics on her phone. The company website was sleek, professional, light on details but heavy on impressive client testimonials. The leadership page showed a photo of Cyrus Vale, early 30s, serious expression, the kind of professional headshot that was designed to project competence and confidence without revealing anything personal. She clicked through to news articles. Northline has been featured in several financial publications. Founder and CEO Cyrus Vale had built the company from nothing after a previous startup failed. Self-made success story, known for brilliant algorithm design and aggressive business tactics. One article mentioned his background briefly. Foster care system, no. Family connections, entirely self-funded through his first ventures. Built his company on the principle that you couldn't trust anyone but yourself, and the numbers never lied. Serenity read that line twice. Couldn't trust anyone but yourself. She understood that philosophy. I had seen it before in people who'd been hurt enough times that isolation felt safer than connection. Her father had rented to several people carrying that particular wound. Treated them with extra patience, understanding that their defensive walls were protection, not personality. "Give them time," Walter had told her once, talking about a tenant who had been hostile for the first 6 months before slowly warming up. People who've been abandoned learn to leave first. They're not mean, they're scared. Patience is the only thing that works. 2 weeks later, moving trucks arrived at Harborview's service entrance. Serenity watched from the lobby as expensive furniture was unloaded. Modern pieces, all clean lines and neutral colors. Nothing personal, no artwork, no plants, no touches that suggested a home rather than a showroom. She didn't meet Cyrus that day. He was at his office, letting the movers handle everything. But she saw the result when Arturo gave her the penthouse walkthrough 3 days later. The space was immaculate and sterile. Furniture arranged with mathematical precision. Nothing on the walls. The kitchen looked unused except for an expensive espresso machine and a cabinet full of protein bars. His bedroom was barely furnished. A bed, a dresser, nothing else. The second bedroom had been converted into an office with trading monitors, covering one entire wall and a desk that looked like mission control. He works from home a lot, Arturo explained, monitoring markets, running his algorithms. Told Jordan he needs absolute privacy during trading hours. No interruptions, no unexpected visitors, no maintenance unless it's an emergency. What about cleaning? Twice a week, Tuesday and Friday mornings. He leaves by 7:30 for his downtown office. Wants the place cleaned and empty before he gets back. You'll have a key and the alarm code. He doesn't want to see you or interact unless absolutely necessary. Serenity walked through the penthouse, seeing past the expensive furniture to what it revealed about the man who lived here. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress, a place to work and sleep, carefully designed to keep the world at a safe distance. The only personal item she found was a coffee mug sitting by itself on the kitchen counter. White ceramic with a painted lighthouse. Chipped on one side, the paint faded from years of use. It looked ancient compared to everything else in the apartment. "What's the story with the mug?" she asked Arturo. No idea. The only thing he unpacked himself. Carried it in personally, set it right there, told the movers not to touch it. Serenity studied the lighthouse mug, understanding that it mattered in ways the $10,000 couch didn't. This was the real Cyrus Vale, not the expensive furniture or the trading monitors, but whatever memory that mug represented. Her first day cleaning the penthouse, she treated that mug like it was made of gold. Cyrus Vale left at 7:15, barely glancing at her as Arturo made brief introductions in the doorway. "Mr. Vale, this is Serenity. She'll be handling your unit." "Fine." He was already on his phone, pulling up market data. "Don't touch my office equipment. Don't move any paperwork on my desk. Everything else, do whatever you need to do." "I'll stay out of your way," Serenity replied, her voice professional and neutral. "Great. I've got a call in 5 minutes." He grabbed his briefcase and left without another word. Serenity stood in the empty penthouse and took a slow breath. This was it. This was what her father wanted her to experience, being invisible to someone who probably made more in a month than most people, made in a year, but who couldn't spare 30 seconds for basic courtesy. She started in the kitchen, washed the single coffee cup in the sink, not the lighthouse mug, which sat unused on the counter, wiped down surfaces that barely showed signs of use, organized the takeout menus that were scattered across the counter. The refrigerator told a story: energy drinks, expired yogurt, nothing else. This was a man who didn't cook, didn't eat at home, didn't do anything that required slowing down long enough to be present. His bathroom was functional, expensive products, but used without care. Towels on the floor, toothpaste cap left off, the kind of casual disorder. That came from never thinking about who cleaned up after you. His bedroom was barely touched. The bed slept in but was not made. Expensive sheets that he probably didn't even notice. Clothes dropped wherever he'd taken them off, like he'd never considered that someone else would pick them up. The office was exactly as Arturo had described. Monitors everywhere, papers in careful stacks. A level of organization that contrasted sharply with the rest of the apartment. This was where Cyrus actually lived, where he focused all his attention and care. Serenity cleaned around the edges, careful not to disturb anything. Dusted the monitors, emptied the trash, vacuumed, left everything exactly as she'd found it, except cleaner. As she worked, she noticed things. A prescription bottle for sleep medication in the bathroom. The complete absence of any photos or personal items, except that one mug. Books on the shelf, all business and finance, nothing that suggested he read for pleasure. This was loneliness, she realized. Not the kind that came from lacking money or success, but the kind that came from building walls so high that nobody could climb them even if they wanted to. Over the following weeks and months, Serenity fell into a rhythm with the penthouse. Tuesday and Friday mornings, 6:30 arrival, cleaning completed, before Cyrus returned from his office. They barely spoke. He left for work before she arrived most days. When their schedules occasionally overlapped, he'd nod in her direction and disappear into his office with his phone pressed to his ear. She learned his patterns. He worked obsessively, often through the night, based on the coffee cups and energy drink cans she'd find in the morning. He took calls at all hours. She could hear his voice through the door sometimes. Always tense, always about numbers and positions and market movements. He never cooked, lived entirely on takeout and protein bars. The expensive kitchen went unused except for the coffee maker. He was careful with the lighthouse mug. That never ended up in the sink or dishwasher. He washed it by hand and returned it to its spot on the counter, the only ritual of care in his entire apartment. Serenity started leaving small improvements. When she noticed his charging cables were tangled disasters, she organized them. When his mail piled up unopened, she sorted it by importance. Urgent bills on top, junk mail at the bottom. When his dress shirts started looking wrinkled, she left a business card for a good laundry service tucked into his closet. He never thanked her, never acknowledged the small acts of care. But he used the systems she created, followed the organization she implemented, and seemed to move through his space a little easier because she'd made it more livable. 4 months into cleaning his penthouse, Serenity realized something that bothered her. Cyrus Vale had no idea she existed as a complete person. To him, she was a function, cleaning service, a line item in his monthly expenses. She tested this theory one morning when they overlapped. She was finishing the kitchen when he emerged from his bedroom, already on a call. "No, tell them we're not accepting their counteroffer," he said into his phone, walking right past her to grab his briefcase. "If they can't meet our terms, we walk." He picked up his keys from the counter she'd just cleaned, stepped around the bucket she was using, and left without once making eye contact. She'd been 3 feet away from him, had said good morning when he'd entered the kitchen. He'd looked right through her, like she was furniture. That night, Serenity sat in her own apartment 15 floors below and wrote in the journal she'd been keeping. Month 10 of working at Harborview. "I understand now why Dad wanted me to do this. It's not about learning to clean or even about building operations. It's about experiencing what it feels like to be invisible to people who have power over your livelihood. Cyrus Vale isn't cruel, he's absent. He's built a life so focused on his work and his walls that he literally cannot see the people around him. I don't think he's trying to be dismissive. I think he genuinely doesn't register that I'm a person with thoughts and feelings and a life outside his apartment, and that's somehow worse than deliberate rudeness. At least rudeness acknowledges you exist." She closed the journal and looked around her own space. Modest but comfortable, personal items everywhere, photos of her father, artwork she'd collected, books she read for pleasure, evidence of a life being lived rather than endured. Cyrus Vale was successful by every external measure: money, career, penthouse apartment. But he was also profoundly alone in a way that all his success couldn't fix. And Serenity, cleaning his toilet twice a week while owning the building he lived in, was learning the most important lesson her father had wanted to teach her: that wealth and power meant nothing if you couldn't see the humanity in people around you. That success without connection was just expensive isolation, that you could have everything and still have nothing that actually mattered. She would spend the next 2.5 years cleaning Cyrus Vale's apartment, watching him live his carefully controlled life, learning patience and compassion for someone who'd been hurt so badly that distance felt safer than trust. She had no idea that one day, in an elevator stuck between floors, he would drop his walls long enough for her to see the person beneath the defenses, or that she would make the mistake of caring about someone who saw her as invisible. But that was still years away. For now, she simply cleaned, observed, and practiced the grace her father had shown to everyone who'd ever rented from him, even the ones who couldn't see him clearly enough to appreciate it. The lighthouse mug shattered on a Tuesday morning in February, 18 months after Cyrus Vale moved into Harborview. Serenity arrived at 6:30 to find him still in yesterday's clothes, sitting at his dining room table surrounded by monitors showing red numbers. The penthouse smelled like stale coffee and stress. He'd clearly been up all night. She let herself in quietly, started her usual routine in the kitchen. That's when she saw the shards of white ceramic scattered across the marble floor, coffee pooled around them. The lighthouse mug, the only thing in his entire apartment that seemed to matter to him. Cyrus sat 15 feet away, staring at his screens like they'd personally betrayed him. His hands were shaking. "Mr. Vale," her voice was careful. "Are you all right?" "Don't." The word came out sharp. "Just don't touch it. I'll clean it up myself." But she was already kneeling, carefully picking up the larger pieces. The lighthouse was intact on one fragment, the paint still bright despite years of use. "I said don't touch it." He stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. "That's not just some random mug. It was..." His voice cracked. "It's not replaceable." Serenity looked up at him, really looked, and saw past the anger to the grief underneath. This wasn't about a broken mug. This was about whatever the mug represented, whatever memory it held that mattered more than all his expensive furniture combined. "I understand," she said quietly, "but yelling at me won't put it back together. The simple truth of that seemed to hit him. He sank back into his chair, put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "I lost a lot of money this morning. God, I'm sorry." Serenity gathered the pieces carefully, placing them in her palm like they were precious. "This was special to you?" "My foster mother gave it to me." The words came out flat, exhausted. "The only foster mother who she's gone now. That mug was from the 6 months I lived with her family. The last 6 months felt like home." Serenity nodded slowly, studying the fragments. She understood now. This wasn't just a mug. It was evidence that someone had cared about him once, proof that he'd belonged somewhere, even if only briefly. "I can try to glue it back together," she offered. "I'm pretty good with broken things. It won't hold coffee anymore, but you could keep it. Use it for pens or something. You don't have to do that." "I know." She met his eyes. "But I'm going anyway." She took the pieces home that night, spent 2 hours carefully applying adhesive, holding fragments in place while they set. The cracks would show, there was no hiding them, but the mug would stand again. Different, but still useful. On Friday she brought both mugs to his penthouse. The glued, original, placed carefully on his counter with a note for the things worth keeping. Still useful, just different. And a new mug she'd found at 3 different shops before locating one similar enough to matter. White ceramic, painted lighthouse, not identical but close. Another note tied to the handle, for the rough mornings. When she arrived the following Tuesday, both mugs were in use. The glued one held pens on his desk. The new one sat by his coffee maker, a small ring of coffee residue proving he'd actually used it. He didn't say thank you, didn't acknowledge the gesture directly, but something had shifted. When she arrived that morning, he looked up from his monitors and actually made eye contact. "The mug works great," he said. "Thank you." 2 words, simple, insufficient, but genuine. "You're welcome," Serenity replied, and meant it. The coffee ritual started 3 weeks later, almost by accident. Serenity had been making herself a cup in his kitchen, something she rarely did, preferring to wait until her shift ended. But it had been a long morning, and she needed the caffeine. She was adding her usual dash of cinnamon and small amount of milk when Cyrus emerged from his bedroom earlier than expected. "Sorry," she said, moving to dump it out. "I'll get out of your way." "No, it's fine." He paused, noticing her cup. "What is that? It smells different than mine." "Coffee. It smells better than burnt regret." He said it without thinking, then seemed surprised by his own honesty. Serenity smiled slightly. "This is actual coffee, cinnamon and a little milk. My father's recipe. Cinnamon in coffee? Just a dash. Enough to warm it without overwhelming the flavor." She took a sip, watching him over the rim. He said coffee should slow you down, not speed you up. Make you present instead of just awake. Cyrus stood there in his kitchen, clearly torn between his routine and curiosity. "Want to try?" Serenity offered, already reaching for a second cup. "I don't usually—" "I know. Black, no time to taste. I've been making your coffee for 18 months, Mr. Vale. I could brew it in my sleep." She poured the second cup, added the same careful measures. "1 sip won't kill you." He took the cup. Their fingers didn't touch, but the moment felt strangely intimate anyway, standing in his kitchen. At 6:30 in the morning, both in work clothes, sharing something neither had planned. He sipped, paused, sipped again. "This is really good," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "My dad drank it this way every morning. Said it reminded him to be grateful for small things." Her voice carried the grief she still felt 3 years after Walter's death. "Your dad passed away?" 3 years ago. Heart attack, very sudden." She set down her cup. "He left me some things. Property, mostly. But the real inheritance was how he saw people." "What do you mean?" "He didn't measure worth by job titles or bank accounts. He measured it by how you treat people who can't do anything for you." The words hung between them, a quiet challenge neither acknowledged directly. Cyrus was quiet, processing. What did he do? For work? Real estate? Small buildings, residential properties. He cared more about communities than profit margins. She smiled slightly. Drove his investors crazy. Sounds like a good man. The best man. Her voice was soft with memory. I'm still trying to figure out how to be worthy of what he built. After that morning, coffee became their ritual. Not every visit, but often enough that Serenity started timing her breaks for when she knew he'd be in the kitchen. They'd talk, brief conversations that felt significant precisely because they were rare. He told her about Northline dynamics, his algorithms, his constant battles with investors who wanted faster growth than sustainable development allowed. She asked good questions, showed genuine interest, understood his work in ways that surprised him. You know a lot about market psychology, he said one morning, 6 months ago now. For someone who, he stopped himself, for someone who cleans houses. She finished the sentence without offense. I read behavioral economics mostly. How people make irrational decisions because emotions override logic. You read behavioral economics for fun? I read it to understand people. Money decisions are never really about money. They're about fear and hope and all the stories we tell ourselves about security and worth. She refilled her coffee. Like that Henderson Tech merger you're reviewing. The debt ratios are off. Executive compensation packages are too generous right before a major acquisition. Classic signs of a company hiding problems. Cyrus had stared at her. How do you know about Henderson Tech? I pay attention. You left the prospectus on your counter last week. She met his eyes. You should pull out. The deal's going to collapse. I appreciate the concern, but I'm paying you to clean, not to give business advice. The words had come out more condescending than he'd intended. Serenity had simply nodded, finished her coffee, and gone back to work. 3 days later, Henderson Tech collapsed. Cyrus lost $40,000. He never mentioned that she'd warned him. Never acknowledged that someone he'd dismissed had seen the problem he'd missed. But Serenity noticed that he started leaving financial documents in plain view more often. Started asking her opinion on things, casually, like he wasn't really asking for advice, even though that's exactly what he was doing. What do you think about this? He'd say, gesturing to a quarterly report. Just curious about your perspective. She'd give honest answers, point out red flags, mention patterns she'd noticed, offer insights. That came from reading obsessively about markets and human behavior. Sometimes he took her advice, sometimes he didn't. But he started listening, which was progress. Their conversations deepened. He told her about foster care, about building Northline from nothing, about the fear that drove him to work 18-hour days, even when he had more money than he'd ever spent. She told him about her father, about learning to see people clearly, about the difference between success that served others and success that only served yourself. You're different, Cyrus said one morning, about 4 months ago. Most people who clean houses, he stopped again, recognizing the trap. Most people who clean houses are what? She kept her voice neutral, giving him room to dig himself deeper or climb out. I was going to say they don't read financial analysis or understand market psychology. But that's stupid. I don't know anything about most people who clean houses. I've never asked. He looked at her directly. Why do you do this work? You're clearly intelligent enough to do anything. Because I wanted to understand something my father taught me. That you don't really know a building until you've cleaned it. You don't really know people until you've served them. She chose her words carefully. And you don't really know yourself until you've done work that society thinks is beneath you. That's beautiful. That's a privilege, she corrected gently. I can choose to do this work because I have options. Most people who clean houses don't get philosophical reasons. They do it because it's the work available. Because 3 jobs at minimum wage still doesn't cover rent and groceries. The conversation had stayed with Cyrus. Serenity could tell because he started noticing the other service workers in the building. Started saying good morning to the doorman. Learned the maintenance crew's names. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. She'd been reshaping his life in subtle ways for nearly 3 years now. The organized cables, the sorted mail, the systems that made his chaos manageable. The coffee ritual that forced him to slow down for 5 minutes each morning. the gentle challenges to his assumptions about work and worth and the value of people he'd previously looked through without seeing. She'd been teaching him, and he'd been learning, even if neither of them fully acknowledged what was happening. But Serenity had also been learning how easy it was to care about someone who couldn't see you clearly, learning the particular loneliness of watching someone build walls and knowing you couldn't knock them down, only wait for him to maybe, someday, open a door. Learning that her father's lesson about serving others was harder than she'd imagined when. Others included people who treated service as invisible labor rather than human connection. 2 weeks ago, everything had started unraveling. External pressure building on both sides. Cyrus is fighting for his company. Serenity wrestling with an offer to sell Harborview that would displace everyone Cyrus walked past without seeing. And yesterday morning, that pressure had finally broken through in words that couldn't be taken back. I'm paying you to clean, not to give business advice, just the maid. After 3 years of coffee and conversations and carefully built trust, that's still how he saw her when stress stripped away his better impulses. Serenity had quit, left his apartment for the last time, prepared to step into her real role and stop hiding behind a service uniform. But before she'd walked away completely, she'd gone back one final time. 10 months before Serenity quit, she and Cyrus got stuck in an elevator together, and everything almost changed. The storm had rolled in fast on a Thursday evening in early January. Rain hammered against Harborview's windows, and lightning flickered across the harbor. By 7 p.m., the building's backup systems were struggling. Serenity had stayed late helping Arturo assess water damage on the upper floors. A seal had failed around one of the 40th floor windows, and they'd spent 2 hours containing the leak and protecting the affected apartment. Her work clothes were damp, her muscles ached, and she was exhausted in a way that came from physical labor combined with the constant mental effort of maintaining her cover. She was heading to her 15th floor apartment when the elevator doors opened on the lobby level and Cyrus Vale stepped in. He was on his phone as usual, pacing in the small space, voice tight with controlled panic. I don't care what the preliminary reports show, he was saying. We need to send a correction to every affected client tonight. Tonight, do you understand? Before they hear about this from anyone else, Serenity recognized a crisis when she saw one. She'd learned Cyrus's rhythms over the past year and a half, knew the difference between his normal stress and genuine panic. She pressed 15. He'd already selected 38. The elevator began its ascent. Get the legal team involved, Cyrus continued, not acknowledging her presence. I want language that's honest but not inflammatory. We made a mistake, we caught it, we're fixing it. No corporate deflection, no hiding behind. The elevator shuddered. Once. Twice. The lights flickered, went out completely, then came back as dim emergency lighting that turned everything yellow-green. The car stopped moving. Serenity's hand shot to the railing, her breathing suddenly shallow. She'd been trapped in an elevator before, knew the statistics about how safe it was, but knowing didn't stop the way her chest tightened when the walls felt like they were closing in. Cyrus jabbed the emergency call button, his phone conversation forgotten. A crackling voice came through the speaker. Harborview Emergency Services. We're aware of the elevator malfunction. The storm caused electrical issues throughout the building. Maintenance is working on it now. Just sit tight. How long? Cyrus demanded. Can't say for sure, sir. Could be 20 minutes, could be longer. Stay calm. You're completely safe. The line went dead. Cyrus kicked the wall, immediately winced, then slid down to sit on the floor. He put his head back against the wall, closed his eyes, and let out a long breath. Serenity stood for another moment, focusing on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The car wasn't shrinking. There was enough air. She'd survived this before. Finally, she sank down to sit across from him, back against the opposite wall. The elevator was barely 6 feet wide. In the dim emergency lighting, they were close enough to see each other, clearly for the first time in 18 months of knowing each other. You okay? Cyrus asked, noticing her controlled breathing. Claustrophobia. Not severe, but elevators test it. I remember. We got stuck before, about 6 months ago. During that power outage, he was quiet for a moment. You handled it well then too. She was surprised he remembered. You talked about birds, terns and plovers, migration patterns. You seemed calmer when I was talking, so I kept going. He looked at her directly. Seemed like the least I could do since we were both trapped. They sat in silence for a moment. The rain hammered against the building. Emergency lighting hummed overhead. "What's the crisis?" Serenity asked. "The one on your phone." Cyrus ran his hand through his hair. "Algorithm bug. Been misreporting client account balances for 3 days before we caught it. No one actually lost money, but the optics are terrible. My primary investor thinks I'm incompetent, and honestly, maybe he's right." "Did you fix the bug?" "Yes, immediately. Put in safeguards so it can't happen again." "And are you being honest with your clients about what happened?" "Trying to be." That's what the calls were about. Legal wants corporate language. I want to tell people the truth. Serenity nodded. "Then your investor's wrong. Bugs happen. What matters is how you handle them. People can forgive mistakes when you're honest and direct. They can't forgive feeling lied to or ignored. You sound like you know something about crisis management." "I know something about people, and about the difference between problems that come from incompetence and problems that come from bad luck." She shifted against the wall, trying to get comfortable. "You're not incompetent, Mr. Vale. You're just human. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "See me. Really see me. Not just the crisis or the money or the demanding tenant who leaves his apartment a mess." He paused. "Most people look through me. They see the success or the problems, but not the actual person. You've been cleaning my apartment for 18 months, and you're the only one who seems to notice I exist as more than a job title." The honesty in that made Serenity's chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with claustrophobia. "Maybe that's because I exist as more than a job title too," she said quietly. "And I recognize the feeling." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment. "I don't even know your last name." "James Serenity." "James, where do you live?" 15th floor. "Been there 3 years." "You live in the building?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "I didn't know staff could—" "I'm not staff. I work for a private cleaning company that contracts with Harborview. I rent my apartment like everyone else." She kept her voice neutral, not mentioning that she also owned the building and paid rent to herself to maintain the cover. "Do you have a family?" "Not anymore. My mother passed away when I was young. My father raised me, and he died 3 years ago. So it's just me now." The loneliness in that statement hung between them. Cyrus understood it immediately. "Just me," he echoed. "I know that feeling." They sat in the dim lighting, 2 people alone in a stuck elevator, sharing the particular isolation that came from having no one who'd notice if they disappeared. "Can I ask you something?" Serenity said. "Fair's fair. Why are you so lonely?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise him. "What makes you think I'm lonely?" "Because I've been in your apartment twice a week for 18 months, and I've never once seen evidence of another person in your life. No photos on the walls, no second toothbrush. No one ever calls you except for work. You eat dinner alone in front of your monitors and fall asleep on your couch instead of your bed because the bedroom feels too empty." Cyrus stared at her. "You notice all that?" "I notice everything. It's my job to pay attention to spaces and what they reveal about the people who live in them." She paused. "So why? You're successful, intelligent, not unpleasant to look at. You could have people in your life if you wanted them. Not unpleasant to look at." Despite everything, he smiled slightly. "Don't let it go to your head." The smile faded. Cyrus was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because everyone leaves. Foster homes, investors, girlfriends. Everyone finds a reason eventually. And I got tired of being the one left behind. So I built a life where I didn't need anyone. I couldn't be disappointed when they walked away." He looked at her directly. "Did it work?" "No. It just meant I was alone on purpose, instead of by accident. Turns out that doesn't feel any better. What changed? Serenity asked. Because something's changing. I can see it. You changed it. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Showing up twice a week, making coffee with cinnamon, leaving notes that made me laugh, fixing things I didn't ask you to fix. You've been present, real. And it made me realize how much I've been hiding from anything real. The elevator suddenly lurched. They both grabbed the railing. The lights brightened back to normal, and the car began moving upward. Serenity stood quickly, grabbed her bag. The moment was breaking, reality returning. The elevator dinged at 15. She stepped into the doorway, then looked back at him. Call your clients, Mr. Vale, the biggest ones, personally, tonight. Don't let your investor control the narrative. People can forgive mistakes when you're honest with them, but they can't forgive feeling like they've been managed. I will. And Cyrus. She used his first name deliberately, testing. Being lonely on purpose doesn't make you safer. It just guarantees you'll be alone. There's a difference. The doors started to close. He reached out to stop them. Serenity, wait. I'll see you tomorrow, she said softly. 6:30, your apartment, like always. Like always, he repeated, but they both knew it wasn't true anymore. The doors closed. The elevator carried him up to his penthouse. Serenity stood in the 15th floor hallway for a long moment, her heart beating faster than the claustrophobia explained. She'd broken her own rule, had let herself be seen, had let him matter, had crossed the line from invisible service into actual connection, and she could tell from the look in his eyes that he'd felt it too. That night, Cyrus called 14 clients personally, explained the bug, the fix, the safeguards, listened to concerns, answered questions without corporate deflection. 12 of them committed to staying. 2 wanted to think about it. When his investor called the next morning, furious that Cyrus had gone rogue with client communication, Cyrus was ready. I didn't go rogue. I did my job. These are my clients, my company, my responsibility. You want a CEO who hides behind lawyers and PR firms. You picked the wrong founder. The investor had backed off, not happily, but he'd backed off. And Cyrus understood that the advice that saved his company had come from someone he'd been treating as invisible for 18 months. Someone who saw him clearly enough to know exactly what he needed to hear. That Friday morning, when Serenity arrived at 6:30, she found Cyrus in his kitchen making coffee. With cinnamon, the way she'd taught him. He poured 2 cups and handed her one. Client calls went well, he said. 12 definite stays, 2 maybes. Investors pissed but backing off. Told you. Honesty works. You were right. He met her eyes over his coffee cup. About a lot of things. They stood in his kitchen, drinking coffee in comfortable silence. And something fragile and precious existed between them. Neither of them named it. Neither wanted to risk breaking it by acknowledging it directly. But it was there. Real and undeniable. 10 months later, external pressure and internal fear would shatter that fragile thing with words Cyrus couldn't take back. But for that morning, in that moment, they had coffee and honesty, and the beginning of something that felt like it might become important, if they were brave enough to let it, if the walls Cyrus had built could come down far enough, if Serenity's secret didn't destroy everything when it finally came to light. Too many ifs. But for now the coffee was perfect, and they were both present, and that was enough. The call from Silvergate Group came on a Monday morning 2 weeks before Serenity quit. She was in her 15th floor apartment reviewing maintenance reports when her phone rang. Unknown number, professional tone. Ms. James, this is Lena Park calling on behalf of Silvergate Group. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Serenity set down her coffee, made with cinnamon, always, and pulled up her laptop. I'm listening. We'd like to make a formal offer for Harborview Residences. $92 million. Cash offer, 30-day close. The number hung in the air. It was more than fair. It was generous. Harborview's assessed value was around $85 million. Silvergate was offering a premium. What are your plans for the property? Serenity asked, though she already knew. She'd researched Silvergate extensively after their initial inquiry 6 months ago. Strategic optimization, Lena said smoothly. Harborview has excellent bones and a prime location, but it's not reaching its full revenue potential under current management. We'd modernize the rental structure, convert some units to short-term executive, housing, upgrade amenities to attract higher-income residents. Translation: displace long-term tenants, raise rents, maximize profit. Current management has maintained 97% occupancy for 8 consecutive years, Serenity said quietly. Our tenant retention rate is the highest in the city. People don't leave Harborview. Exactly our point. You've created artificial affordability that limits returns. With proper optimization, we project 40% revenue increase within 2 years. By forcing out families who've lived here for decades. A pause. That's an emotional way to frame market correction, Miss James. These are business decisions, not personal ones. After Lena hung up, Serenity sat staring at the number she'd written down. $92 million. With that money, she could launch the James Foundation immediately. Fund scholarships for hundreds of students. Support small businesses in underserved neighborhoods. Create affordable housing initiatives across the entire city. Help thousands of people instead of just the 400 residents of one building. But those 400 people would lose their homes in the process. She walked through Harborview that afternoon, seeing it through new eyes. Watched the young family in 22 Billions struggling to get their double stroller through the door while juggling groceries. Saw the teenager from 8F doing homework in the lobby because his apartment was too crowded with siblings. Noticed the elderly woman from 4 Billions moving slowly toward the elevator, her cane clicking against marble floors her father had restored 15 years ago. These were the people Silvergate would optimize out of existence. Serenity pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. Started a list. Mrs. Chen, 4B, 15 years, fixed income, nowhere else affordable Sanchez. Family, 8F, 7 years, 3 kids. Mother works hospital nights couple with. Twins, 22B to 2 years. Medical debt, desperately need below market. Rent Cyrus Vale, 38 to 3 years. Pays market rate but... She stopped typing. But what? Cyrus could afford to live anywhere. He didn't need her protection or consideration. If anything, his petition last month to cut staff bonuses proved he saw Harborview as a service provider, not a community. But she thought about their coffee conversations, the elevator confession, the way he'd slowly, gradually started seeing the people around him. He was learning, growing, becoming someone different from the man who'd moved in 2.5 years ago. Was that enough to factor into her decision? Her phone buzzed. Elliot Rowe, her attorney. I heard Silvergate called. Lena Park can't keep quiet about major acquisitions. 92 million, Serenity confirmed. That's serious money. With that capital, the foundation could displace 400 people in the process. She cut him off gently. I can't do it, Elliot. I can't be the kind of owner who sells people's stability for a bigger bank account, even if that account could fund larger dreams. Your father turned down 105 million, Elliot reminded her. For the same reasons, I know. And he was right. She was surprised by how certain she sounded. I'll restructure the other properties to generate more revenue. Use those profits for the foundation. It'll be slower, on a smaller scale than Silvergate's money would allow. But it'll be honest. Walter would be proud. I hope so. Her voice caught. Because I'm about to stop hiding who I am, and that's going to change everything. While Serenity wrestled with moral calculus, Cyrus Vale was fighting his own battle. The email from his primary investor came on a Wednesday, 9 days before the breaking point. Emergency board meeting, Friday 2 p.m. Discussion topic, leadership transition and CEO succession planning. Cyrus read it 3 times, his coffee going cold in the lighthouse mug Serenity had found for him. Leadership transition. They were coming for his company. He called his attorney, who confirmed what Cyrus already knew. The investor had the votes. Could force him out if positioned correctly. They'll offer you a face-saving exit, the attorney explained. Chairman position. consulting role, something that looks good but has no real power. Then they'll bring in professional management and reshape Northline into whatever they want it to be. Can we fight it? You can. But it'll be ugly, expensive, and you might lose anyway. The algorithm bug gave them ammunition. Cyrus spent the next week preparing for war, building presentations, reviewing client retention rates, documenting Northline's growth trajectory. He barely slept, living on coffee and adrenaline, his penthouse reflecting the chaos in his mind. By Friday morning, he was a wreck, exhausted, paranoid, running on fumes and fear. That's when Serenity arrived for her regular cleaning visit. She let herself in at 6:30 to find disaster. Clothes scattered everywhere. Dishes forming archaeology in the sink. His bedroom looked like a bomb site. The air was stale from someone who hadn't opened a window in days. Cyrus sat at his dining table, surrounded by laptops and papers, wearing yesterday's shirt. His hair was uncombed. His eyes were bloodshot. He barely looked up when she entered. Serenity assessed the damage. This wasn't a normal mess. This was a crisis mess, the kind that happened when someone was drowning. She started in the kitchen, quietly loading the dishwasher, wiping down counters. Didn't hum. The space felt too fragile for that. Just worked steadily, creating order from chaos. Cyrus's phone rang. He answered with a sharp, "What?" Listened. "I don't care what he told you. I'm not stepping down. Tell him." He stopped listening. "Fine. I'll handle it myself." He threw the phone onto the couch and went back to typing furiously, jaw clenched. Serenity moved to the living room, started gathering scattered clothes. She began humming softly, almost unconsciously, the melody she used when processing her own stress about Silvergate, about selling, about what her father would want her to do. "Can you not?" Cyrus's voice cut through the quiet. She stopped, looked up. "Not what?" "The humming. I need to focus." "Sorry." She went back to folding his shirts, staying quiet. But 5 minutes later, she was humming again. Not deliberately, just the way you do when trying to calm yourself, using familiar rhythm to steady thoughts. "I said stop." His voice was sharper now, edged with panic. "I wasn't." She caught herself. "Sorry. I'm just trying to help." "Help?" He laughed, bitter and exhausted. "You want to help? Leave the humming for when you're not in my space. Some of us are dealing with actual crises here." The words were wrong. Actual crises. As opposed to what? Her fake ones. "I have crises too, Mr. Vale." She kept her voice level. But something had shifted. "You're not the only person in this building trying to keep lives from collapsing." He looked up then, really looked at her for the first time that morning. Saw her standing there with his shirts in her hands, her expression carefully neutral in a way that meant he'd hurt her. He should have apologized. Should have recognized he was doing exactly what he'd promised himself he wouldn't. Taking stress out on the person who'd shown him nothing but kindness. But he was too far gone in fear, too deep in the patterns of pushing people away before they could leave. "Right," he said, sarcasm dripping from every word. "I'm sure deciding which apartment to clean next is exactly like fighting to keep the company I built from scratch." Serenity set down the shirts very carefully. "That's not what I said. But that's what you meant, right? That your problems are somehow equivalent to mine?" He gestured at his screens, at the chaos of his preparation. "I'm about to lose everything I've worked for because of one algorithm bug. One mistake, and they want to take my entire company. So forgive me if I don't have the bandwidth to care about whatever small problems you're dealing with while you're here cleaning my apartment." The silence that followed was absolute. Serenity stood very still, absorbing the impact of what he'd just said. Not just the words, but what they meant. You're just the maid. Your thoughts don't matter. Your problems don't matter. You don't matter. Except for the function you serve. Everything from the elevator, the honesty, the connection, the vulnerability, evaporated like it had never existed. "Just the maid," she repeated softly. "Got it. Serenity. I didn't—" "No, you're absolutely right." She picked up her bag. "You're paying for cleaning services, not for me to care about what happens to you. My mistake for thinking we were— She stopped herself. I'll make sure your new housekeeper understands the boundaries better. What? Panic crept into his exhaustion. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I quit, Mr. Vale. She moved toward the door, spine straight, voice steady even though her hands were shaking. The agency will send someone else starting Monday. Someone who understands their job is just to clean, not to— Her voice caught. Not to care. Serenity, wait, I didn't mean— Yes, you did. She turned at the door, and for the first time in 3 years, she let him see exactly how much his words had hurt. You meant every word. Because when you're scared and stressed, this is who you are. Someone who measures people's worth by how useful they are to you. Someone who thinks caring is a service you can pay for and dismiss when it gets inconvenient. That's not fair, isn't it? She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. 3 years, Mr. Vale. 3 years of coffee and conversations and me believing you were learning to see people differently. But the moment things got hard, you showed me exactly how you see me. Just the help, disposable. I'm sorry. This meeting with the investor, I could lose everything. And you took it out on me because I'm safe, because I'm paid to be here so I can't really leave, right? She smiled without warmth. Turns out I can leave. I absolutely can. She opened the door. Please, don't go. His voice cracked. Let me apologize properly. You can apologize to your next housekeeper. She paused in the doorway. I hope you win your fight, Mr. Vale. I really do. But maybe when you're done fighting for your company, think about who you're becoming while you fight. Because this version of you, the one who treats people like they're disposable when you're stressed, your foster mother wouldn't recognize him. The door closed quietly behind her. Not a slam, that would have been easier. Just a soft click that sounded final in the too quiet penthouse. Cyrus stood frozen, his words echoing. I'm paying you to clean, not to give business advice. Whatever small problems you're dealing with, just the maid. He sank onto his couch, board meeting in 6 hours, company hanging by a thread, and realized the person he'd just driven away was the only one who'd actually been on his side. The coffee she'd taught him to make sat cold on the counter. The systems she'd created to manage his chaos surrounded him. The glued lighthouse mug with its visible cracks sat on his desk, holding pens. Still useful, her note had said. Just different. He just shattered something that couldn't be glued back together. And this time, it was entirely his fault. Serenity made it to the stairwell before the tears came. Not the elevator. She couldn't face that small space right now, couldn't. That handle being trapped with the memory of what had just happened. So she took the stairs, her work bag banging against her hip with each step, her vision blurred. I'm paying you to clean, not to give business advice. Whatever small problems you're dealing with, the words played on repeat, each repetition finding a new place to cut. 3 years of patience, of grace, of believing he was becoming someone different, destroyed in less than a minute. By the time she reached her 15th floor apartment, she'd made her decision. She was done hiding, done pretending, done watching people treat her like she didn't matter while she held the deed to the building they lived in. Walter James had asked her to learn by serving. She'd learned 3 years of lessons about power and dignity and the casual cruelty of people who never had to think about how their stress landed on others. Time to step into who she actually was. She showered, washing away the physical evidence of cleaning Cyrus's kitchen. Changed out of her work clothes, the comfortable pants and branded polo shirt that marked her as service staff, and dressed in clothes that signaled something different. Tailored grey pants, a crisp white button-down, the blazer her father had given her for her business school graduation. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone new, not because of the clothes, but because of what showed in her eyes. Resolve, mixed with hurt. Strength built on 3 years of watching and learning. Her phone buzzed. Zoya Karim, her father's former business partner and current advisor. I heard Silvergate called, Zoya said without preamble. Lena Park loves to brag. 92 million. 92 million, Serenity confirmed. That's serious money, Serenity. With that capital, the foundation could— Displace 400 people in the process. Serenity moved to her window, looking down at the building's courtyard. I can't do it, Zoya. I can't be the kind of owner who sells people stability for a bigger bank account. Even if that bank account could help thousands instead of hundreds. Even then, she was surprised by how certain she sounded. Dad didn't build Harborview to maximize profit. He built it to provide safe, affordable housing for people who needed it. Selling to Silvergate would erase everything he stood for. Zoya was quiet for a moment. So, what's your plan? Restructure the other properties to generate more revenue. Use those profits to fund the foundation while keeping Harborview exactly what it is. It'll be slower, on a smaller scale, than what Silvergate's money could do. But it'll be honest. Your father would be proud. I hope so. Serenity's voice caught slightly. Because I'm about to stop hiding who I am, and that's going to complicate everything. The undercover work? You're ready to step up publicly? More than ready. I'm done being invisible. After she hung up with Zoya, Serenity sat at her laptop and wrote 3 documents. The first was her formal resignation from the cleaning service. Professional, brief, effective immediately. The second was a letter to Cyrus Vale. She wrote 4 drafts before settling on 3 sentences that were true without being cruel. Mr. Vale, I will no longer be providing cleaning services. Your new housekeeper starts Monday. Thank you for 3 years of employment. S. James. No accusations, no explanations. Just the facts, delivered with the same careful grace she'd shown him even when he didn't deserve it. The third document was longer, a proposal for Harborview's new tenant protection program. Rent increase caps, emergency assistance fund, optional paths to co-ownership for long-term residents. Everything Silvergate Group would hate, and her father would have loved. She emailed it to Elliot Rowe with instructions to prepare formal announcements and schedule a tenant reception for the following Friday. Then she added one more line. Please send a personal invitation to Cyrus, Vale, Penthouse 42A. Make it clear his attendance is expected. That night, Serenity barely slept. She kept thinking about Cyrus's face when she'd quit, the panic that had replaced his anger, the way he'd said, please don't go, like he was just realizing what he was losing. Too little, too late. But despite everything, despite how he dismissed her, she couldn't leave his space. The way it was, chaotic, overwhelming, a physical manifestation of his breakdown. She told herself it was professional courtesy, that any good housekeeper would finish what they'd started. But the truth was simpler and more painful. She cared about him, even hurt and angry, even knowing he'd probably meant every word he had said. She couldn't walk away without leaving his space in order. Saturday morning at 5 a.m., Serenity let herself into Harborview through the service entrance one last time. The building was quiet. Most residents were still asleep, unaware that their lives were about to change, that the invisible owner who'd been cleaning their hallways was about to step into the light and reshape their future. She took the service elevator to the 38th floor, used her key to enter Cyrus's penthouse. The space looked worse than when she'd left it yesterday. He'd obviously been up all night. More coffee cups, more scattered papers, his laptop, still open on the dining table showing some presentation about algorithm integrity. She moved through the space like a ghost, cleaning quietly, loaded the dishwasher and started it running. I gathered the scattered clothes and started a load of laundry, opened windows to let fresh air replace the stale anxiety that had built up over the week. In his office, she straightened papers without reading them, organized cables, and made sure everything was ready for whatever battle he was fighting. She watered the plant by the window, the one that was still alive only because she'd been tending it for 3 years. In the kitchen, she made one final pot of coffee, with cinnamon, the way she'd taught him, left it in a thermal carafe so it would stay warm. She took the apartment keys off her keyring and set them on the counter next to the coffee, along with her resignation letter. Then she walked through the penthouse one last time, memorizing details she'd never consciously noticed. The way morning light hit the harbor view, the small chip in the marble floor near the entrance, the exact spot on the couch where he always sat when he was stressed. 3 years of Tuesdays and Fridays, 3 years of invisible care. 3 years of watching a brilliant, damaged man build walls around himself and wondering if anyone would ever get through. She'd gotten close. In that elevator, in those coffee conversations, in the small moments when he'd let his guard drop, she'd gotten so close to the person he could be when he wasn't afraid. But it wasn't enough. In his bedroom, she found the original lighthouse mug, the glued one she'd repurposed as a pen holder. She picked it up, traced the cracks with her finger. Still useful, she'd written, just different. She'd been wrong. Some things, once broken, couldn't serve their original purpose anymore. They could be repurposed, displayed, remembered, but they could never hold coffee again. Could never be what they once were. She set the mug back down exactly where she'd found it and walked out of Cyrus Vale's apartment for the last time. By the time she reached her own apartment, it was 7 a.m. She changed into casual clothes, jeans and a comfortable sweater, nothing that marked her as either service staff or owner. Just Serenity James, private citizen, preparing to reclaim her life. She spent the rest of Saturday finalizing preparations for Friday's reception, reviewing her speech, confirming logistics with Elliot and Zoya, making sure everything was ready for her public reveal. She didn't think about Cyrus Vale, didn't wonder if he'd won his board meeting, didn't imagine his face when he found her resignation note. At least, she tried not to. Meanwhile, 23 floors above, Cyrus Vale was discovering exactly what he'd lost. He woke at 8 a.m. to the smell of coffee, confused and disoriented. For a moment, he thought it was Tuesday, that Serenity was in his kitchen, that yesterday's disaster had been a nightmare. Then reality crashed back. It was Saturday. Serenity had quit. His board meeting was in 6 hours. He stumbled to the kitchen and stopped short. The space was immaculate. Dishes done, counters wiped, trash emptied. Fresh coffee in the thermal carafe, and next to it his apartment keys and a piece of paper. He picked up the note while shaking hands and read her 3 sentences. Your new housekeeper starts Monday. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. She was really gone. Not just for today or this week, but permanently. He'd driven away the one person who'd shown him consistent kindness with his worst impulses. He poured a cup of coffee, perfect of course, because she made everything perfect, and walked through his apartment, seeing her final gifts everywhere. Organized papers, water plants, fresh sheets on his bed, windows open to let morning in. She'd taken care of him one last time, even after he'd told her that caring wasn't her job. The cruelty of that, the grace she'd shown when he'd given her nothing but dismissal, made him sink onto his couch with the coffee burning his hands. He had to fix this. Had to apologize, had to explain that he'd been terrified and exhausted and falling back on old patterns. But she'd quit the cleaning service. He didn't have her phone number, didn't know her apartment number beyond 15th floor, didn't even know. Wait, he did know her last name. James. Serenity James. He could go knock on every door on the 15th floor until he found her. Could wait in the lobby until she came through. Could. His phone buzzed. Board meeting reminder. The fight for his company. Everything he'd worked for hanging in the balance. Cyrus looked at the coffee she'd made, at the cleaned apartment, at the keys she'd left behind like a quiet goodbye. Then he opened his laptop and started reviewing his presentation, telling himself he'd find her after the meeting. After he saved his company. After he proved he could still lead. He'd find her and apologize properly, and somehow make her understand. The board meeting was brutal, but successful. Cyrus presented his case with clarity born of desperation, showed client retention after personal calls, demonstrated the algorithm fix and new safeguards, made the argument that founder-led companies outperformed those run by hired management. His investor pushed back hard, but when the vote came, Cyrus won. Barely. 6-5, with 1 abstention. He kept his company, won the battle he'd been so terrified of losing. And when he walked out of the conference room at 4 p.m., victorious and exhausted, all he wanted was to tell Serenity, to share the win with the person who'd told him to make those calls, to thank her for seeing what he couldn't when fear had blinded him. He drove home to Harborview, already planning what he'd say when he found her. Arturo Ortega was waiting in the lobby with an ivory envelope. "Mr. Vale," Arturo said, his expression neutral. "This came for you." Cyrus took the envelope, noticed the embossed letterhead, Malik and Rowe Legal Group. "What is this?" "Read it," Arturo said simply. Cyrus opened it right there in the lobby. "Dear Mr. Vale, we are writing to inform you regarding Harborview Residence's ownership. Our client, MS Serenity James, sole owner of the property, requests your presence at a reception on Friday, November 17th at 7 p.m. in the 20th floor community lounge." The world tilted sideways. Serenity James, sole owner. Arturo, his voice came out strangled. "Who is Miss Serenity James?" Arturo's expression didn't change. "The woman who owns this building, Mr. Vale. Has for about 3 years now. Inherited it from her father, Walter James." "What does she look like?" "Brown hair, brown eyes, about 5'6". Usually wears work clothes when she's checking on building operations." Arturo paused deliberately. "You've probably seen her around. She's very hands-on with the property." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. 3 years. 3 years of cleaning his apartment while owning the entire building. Every dismissive comment, every time he'd called her the maid, every assumption about her intelligence, her worth, her place in the world, the petition to cut staff bonuses, he'd been trying to reduce her own employees' pay, the Henderson Tech warning, she probably had better financial advisors than he'd ever access, the behavioral economics books, of course she read them. She managed a $92 million real estate portfolio. "Oh God," he whispered. "The reception is Friday," Arturo said, taking the letter back. 7 p.m. "I'd suggest you attend, Mr. Vale. Miss James doesn't make requests lightly." Cyrus barely heard him. He was too busy remembering every moment through a different lens. The elevator conversation about her father owning property. She'd been talking about this building. Her advice about honest communication. She'd probably sat through hundreds of meetings about tenant relations. The coffee ritual. Teaching him her father's recipe while she owned everything around them. And yesterday morning, when she'd said she had crises too, she'd probably been dealing with a $92 million decision about the building's future, while he'd dismissed her problems as small. He'd told the owner of his building that her problems didn't matter because she was just the maid. Cyrus took the elevator to the 38th floor in a daze, stood in his pristine apartment, cleaned one. Last time by a multimillionaire who'd chosen to serve and understood the full magnitude of what he'd lost. On his counter sat both lighthouse mugs, the broken one holding pens, the replacement she'd bought him. Between them, her keys and her goodbye. He picked up the glued mug, traced its cracks, and knew what he had to do. Friday's reception wasn't just a building announcement. It was his chance to face Serenity James, not as his housekeeper but as his landlord, and, somehow, find words to apologize for the man he'd been when he thought she had no power. The truth was devastating. He'd only started seeing her as fully human when he discovered she owned the building, and that made him exactly the kind of person his foster mother would have been ashamed to know. The week between Cyrus's discovery and the tenant reception felt like purgatory. He spent Tuesday afternoon standing outside every door on the 15th floor, hand raised to knock, unable to follow through. What would he even say? "Sorry I treated you like you were invisible for 3 years while you literally owned the roof over my head." He drafted 17 emails to the generic Harborview management address, deleted them all. Considered sending flowers to Serenity James, 15th floor, but realized how insulting that would be, trying to apologize with a gesture that cost him nothing when he'd dismissed her humanity for 3 years. He researched Walter James obsessively, read every article, every obituary, every mention of the man who'd built a real estate empire on the principle that landlords should care about their tenants' well-being. Found quotes that made him sick with recognition. "You don't truly own a building until you've swept its floors yourself. I measure success by how many families have stable housing, not by how much rent I collect. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. Watch how someone treats people who can't do anything for them. That tells you everything." Cyrus thought about his petition to cut bonuses. About every time he'd complained about building expenses without thinking about the human beings those expenses supported. About 3 years of walking past people like they were furniture, while Serenity watched and learned exactly who he was. By Friday evening, he'd accepted a truth that made him nauseous. He was only sorry because he'd been caught. If Serenity had never quit, if he'd never discovered her identity, he would have continued treating her exactly the same way. Taking her kindness for granted, dismissing her intelligence, seeing her as a function rather than a person. That wasn't growth. That was just self-preservation dressed up as remorse. At 6:45, he stood outside the 20th floor community lounge wearing his best suit, holding a folder of research. He'd done all week. Not on Walter James this time, but on tenant rights, affordable housing, the human cost of optimization. He'd educated himself far too late, but at least he could walk into that room knowing what Serenity was protecting and why it mattered. The lounge was already half full when he entered. He recognized faces he'd walked past for 3 years without really seeing. Mrs. Okafor from 4 Billions, the elderly woman who left sticky note jokes. The Sanchez family from 8F. He remembered Serenity helping their son with the broken dryer. The young couple from 22B with their twins somehow sleep despite the crowd. Jordan Patel stood near the refreshment table, looking nervous. Arturo Ortega was checking chair arrangements with the same careful attention he brought to everything. And at the front of the room, standing beside a simple podium, was Serenity James. She wore a navy dress, professional but not severe. Her hair was pulled back in a way he'd never seen. She'd always worn it down or in a ponytail while cleaning. She looked comfortable, confident, completely in command of the space. She looked exactly like what she was, the owner of a $92 million property who'd spent 3 years learning every detail of what she owned. Their eyes met across the room. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just acknowledged his presence with a slight nod, before turning back to her conversation with 2 people who were probably lawyers. Cyrus found a seat in the back row, feeling like he was watching his own judgment unfold. At 7 sharp, Serenity stepped to the podium. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Serenity James. I'm the owner of Harborview Residences." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Most residents had probably never seen the owner before, had assumed it was some distant corporation or investment group. "I inherited this building 3 years ago from my father, Walter James, who bought it 15 years ago when it was falling apart and turned it into what you see today. He believed that buildings were just concrete and steel, but communities were made of people, and that a landlord's job was to serve the community, not the other way around." She paused, letting that sink in. Cyrus watched several residents exchange glances, some confused, some beginning to recognize her. "Some of you might recognize me from around the building," Serenity continued. "I've been working here in different capacities for the past 3 years, not because I had to, but because my father asked me to truly understand what I owned before I decided what to do with it. He believed you couldn't be a good landlord from a distance, that you had to know people's names, hear their stories, understand what made a building a home instead of just an address." Mrs. Okafor's eyes widened with recognition. The woman who'd helped her carry groceries, who'd listened to her stories about her grandchildren, who'd been there consistently for 3 years. "I'm telling you this now because I recently received an offer to sell Harborview, a very large offer from a development group that wanted to, in their words, optimize the property, raise rents, convert units, maximize profit." The room went silent. Cyrus saw fear flash across faces, parents calculating whether they could afford market-rate rent, elderly residents wondering where they'd go. I turned them down. The relief was immediate, palpable. Mrs. Okafor clutched her grandchild tighter. Someone in the middle actually applauded before catching themselves. "I turned them down," Serenity repeated, "because my father didn't build Harborview to make the most money possible. He built it to provide safe, affordable housing for people who needed it, and I'm not going to undo 15 years of his work for a bigger bank account." She clicked a remote, and a slide appeared behind her. "Harborview Tenant Protection Initiative. Instead, I'm implementing several new policies. First, rent increases will be capped at 3% annually, regardless of market rates. If the market goes up 20%, your rent goes up 3%. Period. Murmurs of disbelief, then hope. Second, I'm creating an emergency assistance fund for tenants facing temporary financial hardship, medical bills, job loss, unexpected expenses. Situations where 3 months of help could prevent eviction. This isn't charity. It's recognition that life happens, and stable housing shouldn't be the first thing you lose when it does. Third, long-term tenants who've been here 5 years or more will have the option, not the requirement, just the option, to enter a lease-to-own program. Build equity in your home instead of just paying rent. Details will be in the packets we're distributing tonight. The room erupted in questions, exclamations, and a few tears. Serenity answered patiently, explaining details, clarifying terms, promising that full information would be delivered to every unit by Monday. Cyrus sat in the back, watching her command the room with the same quiet competence she'd brought to organizing his cable management. Except now, she was organizing people's futures, protecting their stability, choosing community over profit. This was who she'd always been. He just hadn't been paying attention. When the formal presentation ended, and residents clustered around Serenity with individual questions, Cyrus stayed in his seat. He didn't have the right to approach her yet, didn't have the words ready. But she found him anyway. After the last resident left, she walked to where he sat, still in the back row like a student who'd failed the test. Mr. Vale. Her voice was professionally neutral. Thank you for coming. He stood quickly, awkwardly. Miss James the First. Thank you for the invitation. They stood there in the emptying lounge, the power dynamic completely inverted. He was the tenant now, summoned by his landlord. She held all the cards. Would you like to talk? She asked. Privately. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She led him to a small office off the lounge, closed the door, leaned against the desk with her arms crossed, waiting. I'm sorry. The words came out rough. For what I said, for how I treated you, for all of it. Which part specifically? Her tone wasn't cruel, just precise, making him name it. For telling you that your problems didn't matter, for dismissing your advice when you were trying to help me, for treating you like you were invisible except when I needed something. He took a breath. For being the kind of person who only started seeing you as fully human when I found out you had power. That landed. He saw it in the slight shift of her expression. That's the part that bothers me most, Serenity said quietly. Not the bad day or the stress or even the specific words. It's knowing that if I'd never quit, if you'd never found out who I was, you'd still be treating me that way. You're only sorry now because you know I own this building. Because I have power you have to respect. You're right. And the worst part? She pushed off the desk, took a step closer. I think you're a good person, Cyrus. Damaged, defensive, scared, but good. I've seen you help people when you thought no one was watching. I've seen you work yourself sick, trying to protect your employees' jobs. I've watched you slowly, gradually start to see the people around you. But none of that growth extended to me, because I was just the maid. That's not. He stopped. Was it true? Maybe. God, maybe you're right. And that's horrible. Yes, it is. I can't change the past 3 years. Can't undo the assumptions I made, or the ways I was careless with someone who was showing me nothing but kindness. He met her eyes. But I can tell you that the elevator conversation changed something. Before I knew who you were, you told me I was lonely on purpose, and you were right. You saw me clearly when I was trying very hard to be invisible, and it mattered. Then why did you say what you said? Because I was scared. My investor was trying to take my company, and I was falling back on old patterns. Push people away before they can leave. Don't let anyone matter because mattering means they can hurt you. He ran his hand through his hair. I know that's not an excuse. Pain explains behavior. It doesn't justify it. You taught me that. Serenity was quiet for a long moment. You remember that? I remember everything you taught me. I just wasn't brave enough to live it when it mattered. He pulled out the folder he'd been carrying. I spent this week researching. Not your father, though I did that too. But tenant rights, affordable housing, what optimization really means for families like the ones out there. I educated myself far too late, but I wanted you to know I finally understand what you're protecting and why it matters. Understanding and living it are different things. I know. That's why I'm asking, not for forgiveness because I haven't earned that, but for a chance to prove I can be different, to show you that I can treat everyone with dignity, not just people I'm attracted to or impressed by. What does that look like? I don't know yet. But I know it starts with seeing people, really seeing them. Mrs. Okafor isn't just the lady in 4B, she's a grandmother on a fixed income, who makes the best jollof rice in the city and worries about her grandson. The Sanchez family isn't just noise complaints, their parents working multiple jobs to give their kids better opportunities. Jordan Patel isn't just building management. He's a man dealing with his mother's dementia while trying to keep 400 residents happy. Serenity studied him. You learned all that this week. I learned it over 3 years. I just wasn't paying attention until now. He set down the folder. I also withdrew my petition about the bonuses, sent a letter to every resident who signed it, explaining why I was wrong. That was before I knew who you were, by the way. Right after you. Quit. Because you were right. When we're stressed, we show who we are. And I didn't like who I'd shown you. Why should I believe you can change? Because I already have in small ways. Because of you. The coffee ritual that makes me slow down. The way I organize things now. The fact that I actually see the people in this building instead of walking past them. He took a careful step closer. And because I want to be someone your father would have been willing to rent to. Someone who measures worth by how I treat people who can't do anything for me. Serenity's expression softened slightly. My father would have rented it to you. He had a soft spot for people who'd been hurt by the system. Foster kids especially. He would have seen past your defenses to the person underneath. The person who broke his own lighthouse mug in a tantrum. The person who kept it for 23 years because it was the only proof someone had loved him. She met his eyes. I'm not interested in being your redemption project, Cyrus. I'm not here to fix you or teach you how to be better. You have to want that for yourself. I do want it. But I also want... He stopped, made himself be honest. I want to know you, the real you, not the version who made herself smaller to fit my assumptions. I want to hear about the business books you read and the foundation you're planning and what your father's voice sounded like. I want to tell you about board meetings and algorithm bugs and all the boring parts of my life that I've never shared with anyone because I was too afraid they'd leave. Why? Because in that elevator, for 53 minutes, I wasn't alone. Not because you were trapped there with me, but because you chose to be present, to listen, to care. His voice got rough, and I've been alone for so long that I forgot what the alternative felt like, until you showed me. Then I ruined it, and I'd like the chance to not ruin it again. Serenity was quiet for a long time, studying him with those brown eyes that saw too much. Finally, coffee. Tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. The lobby cafe. We sit across from each other as equals and have one conversation. After that, I decide if there's a second one. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm a tough audience, Mr. Vale. Cyrus, he corrected gently. If we're starting over, I'm just Cyrus. Then, I'm just Serenity. She moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the handle. And Cyrus, what you said about wanting to be better, I need to see that with everyone, not just with me. Mrs. Okafor, the Sanchez family, Arturo, Jordan, all the people you've walked past for 3 years. If you're only kind to me because you're interested in me, that's not growth. That's just self-interest with better packaging. Understood. She opened the door, then looked back. The coffee I made last Saturday. Did you drink it? Every drop. It was perfect. I know. And this time she did smile. Small but real. Tomorrow, Cyrus, don't be late. If you've ever been given a second chance you didn't deserve, drop a comment and tell me about it. Because that's what we just witnessed. Not a guarantee of forgiveness, but an opportunity to prove that. Change is possible when someone cares enough to be honest and someone else is brave enough to listen. Cyrus and Serenity met that Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Their conversations weren't easy. She called him on every assumption, every moment where he slipped back into old patterns. He learned to apologize faster, listen deeper, recognize when his fear was making him cruel. He started joining the building's community events, helped Milo Sanchez with his coding homework, listened to Mrs. Okafor's stories about her grandchildren, learned that Jordan Patel was dealing with his mother's dementia, and offered the name of a specialist without being asked. Serenity watched him change, not perfectly, not without stumbles, but genuinely. I watched him become someone who saw service workers as people, who asked questions instead of making assumptions, who measured his worth by who he helped instead of what he owned. 6 months later, they were friends. Real friends, built on honesty and equality, and the understanding that both of them were works in progress. 8 months later, over coffee in that same lobby cafe, Cyrus said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Serenity set down her cup, cinnamon and milk, the way her father had taught her, and smiled. "I know. I've been waiting for you to catch up. How long have you known?" "Since the elevator. But I needed you to become someone I could actually build something with. Not the guy who needed me, but the person who chose me. There's a difference. And am I that person? You're becoming him. That's enough." They didn't rush, didn't let attraction override the foundation they were building. But eventually, carefully, they became more than friends. Became partners who challenged each other, supported each other, called each other on their worst impulses, and celebrated their best moments. Became the kind of love that only exists when two people see each other clearly, all the cracks, and broken pieces and glued together parts, and choose each other. So, what's the lesson here? What's the point of Cyrus and Serenity's story? Never judge people by the role they play in your life. That housekeeper, that server, that delivery driver, they're complete human beings with dreams, and intelligence and value that has nothing to do with the service they provide you. Treat them accordingly. Your character shows in how you treat people when you're stressed, not when everything's easy. Pain and pressure don't create who you are, they reveal it. If you're cruel when you're scared, that's something to fix, not excuse. Real power isn't about control, it's about choice. Serenity had the power to evict Cyrus, to humiliate him, to make his life miserable after he dismissed her. She chose kindness instead. That's strength. Second chances require real change, not just better words. Cyrus didn't win Serenity back with an apology. He won her back by becoming someone different, someone who treated everyone with dignity, not just the people who mattered to him personally. The most valuable relationships in your life will be the ones where you, fully seen, cracks, flaws, broken pieces, all of it, and chosen anyway. Not despite your imperfections, but including them. That's what love looks like when it's built on truth instead of fantasy. If this story moved you, I need you to do 3 things. Hit that like button. Let me know this message landed. Drop a comment telling me about a time you underestimated someone, or a time someone underestimated you. Share your story. This community is built on honest conversations about real struggles. Share this video with at least 3 people. Send it to someone who works in service and needs to hear that their work has dignity. Send it to someone who's forgotten to see the people around them. Send it to someone who needs to believe that change is possible. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Mr. Steele Rich Stories and turn on those notifications. Because we're just getting started with stories that challenge how you see the world and the people in it. Remember, buildings are just concrete and steel. Communities are made of people. And the measure of your life isn't what you own or what you achieve. It's how you treat people when you have power over them. Cyrus Vale learned that lesson the hard way. You don't have to. Thanks for reading. I'll see you in the next story.